all.
Commissioner Siegel here.
Commissioner Forstall present.
Danaher present.
Jackson present.
Johnston present.
Lauren Smith present.
Okay, thank you. Any oral communications from the town? I haven't seen any up here. All right. Approval of the minutes. Were there any comments on the minutes from the last meeting?
One typo.
One typo, all right. I'll tell you what, why don't we deem the typo approved, and you can give that to Dean or whoever afterwards. And is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Approve the minutes as amended.
As amended.
I second.
Second, okay, all in favor? Aye. Done, good. Agenda review, any comments on the agenda from folks? All right. Reports from commissioner meetings and events. Anybody want to report anything on that? Okay. Then Director of Utilities report.
All right. Good evening, Chair Danaher and commissioners. Welcome back from a month being off. I hope the summer's going well for all of you. The first thing I wanted to do was I have some updates portions that kind of roll into July. So the first one was on July 5th, the city hosted an open house at the Municipality Center to showcase some of the behind-the-scenes work that we do for the Palo Alto community. The event included some special project demonstrations from the utilities department. Almost all the departments were there. Fire was there, police was there, Park and Rec were there, Zero Waste was there, and more than 400 citizens, public attended. They were able to visit with staff and learn about city services and fun environment. So there are some photos up on CPAU's smugmug.com. And then we also have this video slide. So I wanted to thank you. I wanted to show this before we go a little further. This was just a quick little video that we took from the open house. There should be some sound, but there, I guess, yeah.
Did anyone get it into the bullseye?
There was a few folks. So most of these shots that you're seeing right now are mostly from a utilities perspective. So the first couple ones were from the Power Resource Group as well as engineering and then operations. And then we had large vehicles staged out throughout the yard along the electric side. And there was a dunk tank that management was involved in. Ed actually got in there and was the last one. It was for about 20 minutes that we were in the dunk tank at that point. So, and then, like I said, there was other events that were going on. This is from Public Works right now on the backhoe bowling that they do. And then, like you say, the tree group was out there as well. I had some events with the throwing a rope through some tires at different heights to kind of simulate grabbing onto some of the limbs. And then there's a shot here where you can see where their chainsaws and where they were cutting that tree in half. So it was a fun event. It was from 9 to 2. Like I said, we had over 400 residents that showed. It was on the 5th. The day after the 4th, so might not have been the best day for us to have at that time. So, but we're going to rethink that process. We did put some surveys out asking if the public would like to see it again on a yearly basis or bi-yearly, and it was overwhelmingly that they really enjoyed it. And so we'll be doing another one. We'll have to pick a different date, I think, than from that. We've done it last year, we did it on the weekend, thinking that we were going to get quite a few folks to come in on the weekend. But we, and then, like I said, the turnout was actually not too bad. Like I said, for this year, we had, again, for over 400 people that showed up. So it was great. It was great to see the families come out and things like that. So, second of all, we are proud to announce that CPA received a National Energy Innovation Award for our home efficiency Genie program. We were honored to accept the award in June at the American Public Power Association conference. The Genie program, which began back in July of 2015, was recognized for its application of creative energy efficiency techniques, technologies, and accessible simplicity. The program optimizes home efficiency by providing individual tailored energy and water efficiencies recommendations to residents by providing free advice over the phone once they sign up. And then the Genie has become a trusted and reliable resource for our customers. The house call assessments cost about $149, but if the homeowner does take up some of the recommended projects, then that $149 is put towards whatever that efficiency that they would want to do. And then at that point, they can call anytime to the phone to the representatives, and they'll give them any kind of advice that they would like to do for basically forever at that point. So it's highly successful when we do our surveys. We find that the homeowners really, really appreciate it a lot. So, it's a great program for us. Just an update on utility work at Churchill and Tran tracks. So I know all of you are aware that Caltrans is wanting to put in electric trains, and so we have 13 crossings that go throughout the city of Palo Alto that has power lines, fiber. It has AT&T as well as Comcast that go over those train trestles. And the thing is that they're going to build this catenary device, so almost like what you see in San Francisco from the trolley cars. So they'll have this type of apparatus that will go up over the top. Well, at this period of time, our lines are too short. They're too low. And there's not enough clearance at that point. So we are going to bore some of them into place underneath the train tracks, and then some of them we are going to put in larger poles in some of the crossings. So this first one down on Churchill is one that was bored. It was planned a workaround during the summer break because it was in front of some of the high schools and other schools in the area. And the streets and sidewalks are being restored right now, and the construction is scheduled to be completed on Friday. So we'll be out of those school areas during that period of time. Another one is Palo residents can now receive discounts on solar and zero emission vehicles through the Bay Area Sunshade Shares program. SunShares combines a regional group by approach and vetted contracts to provide discounts on rooftop solars, zero emission vehicles, and the program is available to anyone in the Bay Area through November the 15th. And then if you want to register, it goes to bayareasunshares.org. Another one is that for a limited time through September 30th, Palo Alto Utilities customers and utility employees can receive rebates on the Nissan Leaf EV. The American Public Power Association, APPA, is participating with the Nissan to offer public power utilities with rebates for purchasing of 2019 Nissan Leafs standards or the 2019 Leaf E+. And it's a rebate offered cannot be combined with the discount if they decide to go through the SunShares. But it's a program that will be shortly through September 30th. And so residents will be able to decide which, if they were looking for an EV, if they decided that they wanted the Nissan, it could go through either one, through the SunShares or through this other one where Palo Alto will have the rebate portion of it. Another thing is, just for yourselves to know, is that Utilities has contracted with a professional meter, PMI, to perform field audits of our utility meters. So we're going to actually have people that are going to be going around. They'll have the contractor sign from Utilities as well as they'll have IDs on them. And what the idea is that this was a recommendation that came out of an audit some years ago from our auditors, from the city auditors. But more importantly, it puts us in place to be able to look at the type of meters, the condition where the meters are located at, like water boxes, lids, things like this. And then also, more importantly, is just to get the meter numbers, the sizes of the meters, so that when we redo the CIS, we'll have some information. Because, as all of you know, in the past, we've questioned some of the meters that are actually out there. So this is going to be a way that we are going to actually have them go out and audit this information. And there's a whole list of things that they will bring back, photos of the location, and they'll be doing all three meters. So they'll be doing the water meter, the electric meter, and the gas meters. So that's going to be starting up next week. We're hoping to have the contractor fully trained at that period of time to look at. So the last thing is that that just was put at your places was the utility strategic plan. So this is an update for the last 6 months from January to June, and some of the accomplishments that some of the teams have put together. Remember, is that we broke it out into 4 categories. We did the workforce, collaboration, technology, and then around the finance and optimizing of the financial group, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Finance and
Resource management. So what also came out of that is that you also received one of these power packs. So we had an all-hands meeting this past month where we actually handed these all out to our employees. And if you look at the back side of it, it basically talks about the city's values, and then also CPAU's support and culture of the respect to teamwork, accountability, reliability, and safety. And then it just talks a little bit about the priority focuses that what we just mentioned is the 4 areas that we're looking for. So it was a gift. We're continually pushing with our employees and staff to get involved with one of these groups on a volunteer basis, of course, and so we're moving through. And so this was an update of what's happened in the last 6 months on our strategic plan. And then the last thing was, I know that 2 months ago, we talked about the RFP for the fiber. So on June 24th, the council approved the fiber report that you all saw that changed, basically authorizing staff to change the scope of work and then also to sunset the CAC. So that was approved on the 24th. We're working on the RFP as we speak. Hopefully we'll have it out by the end of the month, and at that period of time, we'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of the RFP that goes out. So all of you will be emailed with that. So I'm hoping to have it out within the next couple of weeks. And at that point, we'll see what kind of responders that we'll have. We'll probably put it out for 30 days on the streets, and see what we can come up with. And it's pretty much the same thing as you saw in the past. It's the 4-phased approach. And hopefully we're going to get some folks that will bid on that contract for us. So with that, I think that's all I have.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Dean. Any commissioner comments? All right. No unfinished business, so we'll get on to the first topic, discussion of the RPS compliance strategy options, which we could use more enlightenment after the last session, so we all agreed.
Good evening, commissioners. Let's see. Okay, take 2. So good evening, commissioners. Jonathan Aubenshine, Assistant Director of Utility Resource Management, and we're bringing this item back to you after a discussion at your last UAC meeting, and we're hoping to bring more clarity to the decisions that are in front of you around different renewable portfolio standard compliance strategies. And I have Jim Stack, Senior Resource Planner, and Lena Perkins, Acting Senior Resource Planner, here to walk you through our request for feedback tonight.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan, and good evening, Commissioners. I'm Jim Stack, along with Lena Perkins, here to present round 3 of our discussion on carbon accounting methodology and RPS compliance strategy options. So we've been here before in May and June, where we kind of focused on carbon accounting methodology approaches. And we talked a little bit about a pretty wide range of options in June that we could use to pursue compliance with our RPS requirements. So we're going to be here tonight to, first of all, we think there was some pretty broad agreement among the UAC members on a handful of those decisions. So we'd like to get kind of confirmation from you that we are interpreting that correctly, and that we can kind of put those to the side and focus on a sort of a narrower set of options to consider for additional feedback. So I'll first talk about those 4 issues that we're seeking confirmation that we're okay with, and then I'll talk about 3 options that we'd like to talk about with respect to the RPS compliance strategy. And we'll go over some of the impacts on the portfolio that those would have. So for part 1, I'll go through some of the things we're requesting affirmation on. The first one is on the change to our carbon accounting methodology. So you'll recall in May and June we presented some analysis looking at our portfolio and comparing the current approach to accounting for the carbon in our portfolio, which is kind of an annual look at it, which assumes that the grid's emissions don't vary significantly throughout the year. And then we looked at the emissions under an hourly accounting approach, which kind of acknowledges that the grid's emissions do actually fluctuate quite a bit, and we looked at how this more granular approach results in a very different answer. So we think there was pretty good agreement that this more granular and more accurate approach is the way to go. It's kind of the gold standard. It's what we should use given the reality of the current grid. And so let's see. So we're kind of seeking affirmation that we are, that you'd like us to go forward with this, and that would involve coming back to you later on for an official recommendation to the council to make an amendment to our carbon neutral plan to account for this change in methodology. So I can pause here and see if there's any.
What's easier for you to go through the whole presentation and have discussion, or take things topic at a time?
I think there's a lot of stuff to discuss, so probably topic at a time. Mike?
So, commissioners remember the discussion of hourly and marginal versus average time. And I think correctly stated that there seemed to be consensus in favor of hourly average accounting, not marginal. Am I correct on that? Everybody?
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
If not, it's all around.
Sounds good. Okay, thank you. All right, so that'll do it tonight for the carbon accounting portion. Now we'll switch over completely to the RPS stuff, where there's a lot more to discuss. So last month when we were here, we presented kind of a lengthy laundry list, a wide-ranging list of different options for complying with our RPS requirements, some of which would have significantly increased our supply costs, and some of which would have resulted in significant cost savings to us. And there was, a little bit less agreement on which direction to pursue in this area. But there was one approach which we think was fairly non-controversial, and there was pretty good buy-in from everybody about. And that was the idea that since our portfolio currently has kind of a systematic surplus every year, assuming average hydro levels, because our load has been dropping in recent years, we have a surplus of resources overall. So we think that a strategy where we sell the excess that we don't need to meet our load, and which we also don't need for complying with our carbon neutral plan, our remaining carbon neutral. That would result in about $1.2 million in savings on average every year over the next 12 years. So we think this is a pretty easy, a no-brainer, a good way to save some money and not have the portfolio looking dirty or causing any consternation with the public. So.
I've been on the commission for our first chance to express support for
Excuse me.
savings measure.
Chair, could I get you to turn on your mic, please? Thank you.
Thank you, yes. So any discussion from commissioners on this point?
Well, I just had a question I want to clarify. When you say you'd sell the excess, and what does that mean practically? Does that mean selling some of our solar contracts, or?
It would mean selling the output of the contracts to other utilities on a short-term basis. So we would, we probably not do anything long-term because we don't want to sell anything and then have a very dry hydro year and have to go out back to the market and buy it back later on. So we would kind of wait till about halfway through the year when we know what hydro conditions are and we are quite sure that we have some excess we can sell without getting into any trouble or having any regrets, and sell that on a monthly or quarterly basis.
Okay, that's helpful.
Warren, any questions?
No, I think I'm satisfied.
Okay.
I think the timing of the sale, to your point, is important.
Any questions? Anybody else? Well, I think you have support for that approach as well.
Okay, great. And we think that we have authority under our existing policies. We don't need any additional approval from the City Council, so we can begin implementing that right away.
Okay.
Okay, next on the flip side, there were a couple of proposed, a couple of RPS strategies that we discussed, which are kind of more out in the extremes, which we think there was less support for, and we'd like to kind of just confirm that we can eliminate these from further discussion. So on the one end of the spectrum, in the direction of increasing our supply costs, we talked about one strategy which we called the carbon neutral every hour approach. And that would involve selling probably all of our solar resources, replacing them with a base load renewable resource like geothermal. In addition to that, we would also have to change the way we dispatch our hydro resources such that we could kind of match our supplies with our load on an hourly basis throughout the year. And we think that would be pretty costly, somewhere in the range of an additional $7 million per year in supply costs for that. We also think it wouldn't really have any net impact on our carbon emissions. It might actually increase our emissions from our portfolio because we would be dispatching our hydro resources into less productive parts of the year where the grid is not as dirty. We wouldn't be offsetting as much. So we're recommending against any more further consideration of this approach. I just want your feedback on that.
Okay. Start at this end. Questions?
No, I think it makes sense.
Thank you for removing it from consideration.
Gentlemen? All right. Yeah, we've talked many times about our goal was to carbon neutral at the least possible cost. So
Right.
This makes sense.
Okay. All right, and then on the other end of the spectrum, we did talk about an approach that would result in significant cost savings, and we called that the minimal compliance strategy, which actually involved a few different things, one of which was kind of selling a lot of our in-state renewable resources and swapping those out for less expensive out-of-state resources and kind of maximizing the extent that we would do that. Another element of the strategy, however, was we'd like to actually continue discussing that aspect of the strategy, but another element of the strategy involved kind of using up some of our banked resources that we have, from some of the past 10 years where we've kind of over-complied with the RPS requirements. We've sort of put away in the bank about 1.2 million RECs, and we have those that we can use for future years if we need them. And under a minimal compliance strategy, we actually would use up all those RECs, and that would result in our portfolio looking like we're falling short of our RPS requirements year to year because we would be using some of our over-compliance from previous years to make up for that. And we talked about how there was a lot of concern about the public perception of having a portfolio that looked dirtier than the state requirements would allow us to have. So we think, given that level of concern, that we should probably avoid discussing this any further and just leave those banked recs where they are in case we need them later on down the road.
Well, I think this does get into the discussion about, selling resources in excess of the RPS requirements. So I mean, I'm skeptical of that strategy. I'm comfortable with the strategy of selling resources in excess of the load. And so if we only sell resources in excess of load, what are we using the banked recs for?
Well, if we're only selling, I can show you some numbers about what our RPS level would look like. But if we only sold resources that are in excess of our load, we would still be well above our compliance requirement. So we would actually be continuing to add to our bank of recs that we have that we could use for future years if we needed to.
So we're just saving them.
Essentially, that's what we're doing right now, yes.
I mean, I would be willing to talk about maybe selling some of those recs and recovering the money from doing that. But to me, it's important that we if we adopt as I think we should, the carbon neutral on an hourly basis, and we sell resources in excess of our load, we want to keep some recs handy, but do we really need as many as we have?
Okay.
Can you quantify how many we have and what their market value is?
So we have about 1.2 million in the bank right now, mostly from the past 3 years, where we've had a lot of, our portfolio has grown quite a bit in solar. The market value of those is about $17 or $18 per rec. So that's, what is that, roughly
$20 million.
$20 or $25 million.
Jim, are we actually able to monetize those directly, or are we only able to monetize them by not complying in future years?
Yeah, and the way we would monetize those, we would apply those older recs to our requirements for, say, 2020, and we would sell all of the future recs we generate in 2020 to other utilities. So we would have a portfolio that looks like it would be like our power content label would show essentially 0 renewables for 2020, but we would still comply with the RPS requirement by using all those banked recs, which wouldn't show up on our power content label.
Yeah, we can't sell these recs, these banked recs directly. All we can do is essentially say, hey, we generated excess renewable energy in past years, so we're just going to use dirty energy for the next few years and sell off our, well, not dirty energy actually. We can, we could trade for bucket 3 recs, but essentially would allow us to have a much lower amount of in-state renewables. That's essentially what it would allow us to do, and then it would allow us to sell off more of our in-state renewables and trade those for out-of-state renewables. That's the only way we're able to monetize those banked recs. Did I say anything inaccurate there?
No, and it would look dirty on our power content label because the state doesn't recognize the value of out-of-state recs in terms of being renewable or being 0 carbon on the power content label.
So is there a middle ground here where we can use, on an annual basis, agree to use a certain amount of banked recs? If we can't monetize them and we just accumulate them on a year-on-year basis based upon our current supply, is there a way that we can use them just in a programmed manner, if you will?
Yeah.
Yes, it may not reflect well from a public perspective, but it would be a rationed perspective, right?
Yeah. The approach that we presented in June involved spreading those recs out over 12 years. So kind of every year we would be looking like we were falling a little bit short of the state's requirements in that year, but we'd be making it up with the previous years, spreading that out, the overcompliance from previous years. So
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, can I suggest something that might make this discussion a little easier? Maybe we table this item until we finish talking about the other proposal that we were putting on the table, because essentially what this banked rec proposal allows us to do is go even further than the other proposal that we're proposing to explore in the staff report. So maybe if we table this and come back to it towards the
I
end.
was going to make the same suggestion, so
Okay.
let's move on. Yeah.
Any other questions, or should we move on to
We'll
part two?
come back to that topic later.
Great,
Yeah.
great. All right, so now we'll move on to a few other more narrowly focused options for RPS compliance. Just a quick background, this is one of our favorite slides showing our renewable supplies over the years, starting in 2003, when we began adding to our renewable portfolio. And you can see how they've grown dramatically over the past few years. In 2019, we're at over 60% of our portfolio is coming from renewables. And you can see that there's a line, the black line shows the state's requirement levels, and we're far exceeding those by roughly a 2-to-1 margin. And as we talked about earlier in a previous meeting, because we have so much hydro in our portfolio, we actually have an exemption under the state law, so we don't actually have to have as much renewable supply in our portfolio as the state requirement says other utilities have to have. So we can essentially keep all of our hydro resources and sell some additional renewables and have a slightly lower RPS level and still be compliant. So that lower line there shows the actual amount that we really need to achieve every year, assuming average hydro conditions and assuming that we renew our Western base resource contract beyond 2024.
Can I ask a quick question about this graph? Because it shows the amount of wind power and the amount of landfill gas power diminishing. Is that because those facilities have reached the end of their useful life, or just that our contracts are expiring?
Just that our contracts are expiring. Yep. Okay, so that's the background on our portfolio. Now here is a summary of the three kind of options we'd like to discuss tonight. The first one is actually not what we're recommending, but the current portfolio, or the business as usual approach, where we have about 10% surplus every year on average. So about 10% more resources than we have load under average conditions. The second approach is where we sell all a portion of that excess that we don't need, either to serve our load or for our carbon neutral plan compliance. So under this approach, we would actually keep a bit of our surplus, 4.5% surplus, because that's what we're estimating we need in order to maintain carbon neutral status under the hourly accounting approach. So because of all the solar in our portfolio having kind of a lower emissions value, because it's in the middle of the day when emissions intensities are pretty low, we would actually have to maintain a bit of a surplus in order to avoid having to buy bucket 3 RECs. So that is option number 2. And then option number 3 is where we would sell all of our renewables that exceed the RPS requirement levels and swap those for bucket 3 resources, or out-of-state renewables, which are lower cost. So under that approach, on an annual basis, we would have as many renewable resources as we have load, 100% of our load matched by renewables or hydro, but only 75% of those would be in-state resources. So our power content label would look like it has a portion of it coming from unspecified power, which is how the state would denote those out-of-state renewable purchases. So those are kind of the three main options that we're going to be talking about tonight. A fourth option, which we'll discuss a little bit more later, would be sort of a hybrid approach where we allow customers to choose one of these options. We present them with 2 or more different rates that they could select from, kind of the way Palo Alto Green works right now, where we have where commercial customers can choose to pay a little bit more in order to get some additional, green energy, some RECs. So we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of that in a little bit. But now for some of the numbers about what these, how these strategies would differ. So for the current portfolio, obviously there'll be no change in our supply costs. And our RPS level is, if we maintain our current supplies, would be about 60% on average over the next 12 years. And the current portfolio, whether you're using the hourly accounting approach or using the state's accounting approach, which is based on an annual accounting method, it would have negative emissions associated with it. That's because we have such a large surplus every year. Under option number 2, where we sell off the portion of our resources that exceed our load and that are not needed for maintaining carbon neutrality, that would generate about $1.2 million in cost savings every year. And our surplus would shrink from 10% down to 4.5%. And let's see, that would be a rate impact of 0.7%, and our RPS level would drop to 51%. And then in terms of our emissions accounting, on an hourly basis, it would be 0 emissions for that portfolio. And then on the power content label, it would still look like we have negative emissions associated with the portfolio. The third approach, the more aggressive sales approach, where we sell everything above our RPS requirement, all of the renewables that exceed that level, that would generate an additional $1.9 million in savings on average, so a total of $3.1 million per year. So altogether, there'll be about a 2% rate impact, but the RPS level would drop down to 40%, and the emissions intensity under an hourly accounting approach would be about 137 pounds per megawatt hour, but we could offset that by purchasing additional bucket 3 RECs for our own carbon neutral plan compliance. But in terms of our power content label, it would show up as 97 pounds per megawatt hour for the emissions associated with that portfolio strategy.
I have one question about the economics on the retail rate impact. It's not necessarily that if we save that money, it goes to a refund or a reduction in the...
That's correct, yeah. The next slide, I talk about some of the uses for that savings. It could be as simple as just giving that back to customers as a rate reduction of up to 2%. Or we could devote that money towards other types of decarbonization efforts, building electrification or EV infrastructure investments, or we could invest it in smart meters. So this would be a way to sort of allay some of the concerns about public perception associated with kind of selling some of our bucket 1 in-state resources and trading them for cheaper out-of-state resources. We could kind of message that as saying, hey, we're taking that cost savings and we think it has no impact on the grid's overall emissions, but we're actually going to invest that locally in greater carbon savings here in Palo Alto through these types of initiatives. So.
Is this a good time to talk about the bank, the implications of the bank rec option? Maybe not. Let's hold on to that.
Yep. Okay. Lena just mentioned that in comparing these options and looking at what the carbon intensity of them would look like on the power content label, even the more aggressive approach where the emissions intensity is 97 pounds per megawatt hour is much cleaner than the grid average, which I think is around 400 or 500 pounds per megawatt hour. So it wouldn't look carbon neutral, but it would still be significantly cleaner than the grid average. And then in terms of how the customers would see this, these different options on their power content label, these 3 slides show how the pie chart on the power content label would look to customers in 2020. So the current portfolio shows roughly 60% renewables and 40% hydro, even though we have even more hydro than that. We wouldn't be able to show it all on the power content label. The second option, where we sell supplies that exceed our load, it looks like we have a little bit less renewable supply because we're showing all of our hydro and selling some of that renewables supply there. The third option the difference is we'd be selling more of our renewables and replacing it with out-of-state renewables, and those would show up on the power content label as being unspecified sources. So they would show up as kind of looking like market power. You know, they would look kind of dirty on the power content label to customers.
Now, we have some discretion in how we present our power content label, what editorial content goes with it, right?
I don't believe we do. We can kind of put in some supplemental material to augment the power content label,
Yeah.
but we can't print anything on the label itself that says, you know, we don't think this is accurate.
Where does it appear?
It's a bill insert that we send customers in their bills, usually around September every year.
So we can put anything we
We
want.
could put another insert in there,
Yeah.
you know, kind of presenting our view of the.
Companies have GAAP and non-GAAP accounting.
Right.
And the non-GAAP accounting, they often view as more accurate or insightful view of the business. So, all right, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I talked a little bit about the idea of giving customers a rate option where they could choose from one of these different approaches. And so that would be, you know, we could present them with a premium rate, which could be either the status of the current portfolio, or we have primarily in-state renewables to supply them. Could even be something more expensive, like a carbon neutral every hour type of portfolio. And then the alternative would be a lower cost option, such as, you know, selling all of our supplies that exceed our RPS requirement. So customers could choose one or the other, and those who have, you know, different cost preferences would get a different power content label and a different view of their supply mix. There are a good number of challenges that would be associated with this approach. For example, we would have to choose which rate would be the default, and we kind of have to put all of our customers onto that, and that could cause some, it would require a lot of public messaging, and could cause some confusion and frustration among customers. Also, if customers have the option to switch between rates whenever they want, that would lead to some uncertainty around our supply needs for different types of products. And there would, of course, be a good amount of investment required in terms of staff time and investment.
Just a quick interruption. Is there any support in the commission for customer choice between these different accounting methodologies and RECs or whatever? Okay, let's skip this subject.
Very good. All right. Good call. Thank you. So I can jump to next steps about what we will do, you know, based on the discussion here tonight. So first off, given there's agreement on the carbon accounting methodology, we'll come back to you in a month or so with a formal request for recommendation to council to approve an amendment to the carbon neutral plan for that. Next, based on our discussion around different RPS strategies to pursue, you know, we may come back with some more discussion about that. If there is interest in pursuing an approach where we sell more of our resources, the bucket 1 resources, and swap them for out-of-state bucket 3 resources, we would like to have some discussions with members of the community, particularly the environmental community, about whether they would support that approach, and perhaps depending on what we would do with the revenues, whether they might you know, advocate for that or oppose that. We think that'll be an important consideration. We can begin implementing the simple change where we sell the resources that exceed our load and which we don't need for carbon neutrality. So we'll begin lining up some sales of those resources in the near future. And then finally, next year we'll be coming back to you again with some even, you know, some longer term discussions about the portfolio, because we have some decisions to make in the next couple of years about the Western-based resource contract and a transmission asset that we have connecting California and Oregon to potentially get some resources from the Northwest. So that's where we are, and we're happy to hear any questions you have or any discussion.
Thank you very much. Before we go into questions, Lena, could you sent us an email late this afternoon. It was very informative, I thought, but not everybody's had a chance to see that, I'm sure. So if you could discuss that for us.
Sure. And Jim, could you go back to the pie charts? So that email is pertaining to option number 3, shown in the far right pie chart, where we would sell bucket 1 resources and buy bucket 3 resources, out-of-state resources. And those resources would show up as the hashed green line here, green segment here. And so the gist of the research to date, speaking with folks from EPRI as well as some other academics, is that up to about 25% of trading within the Western Interconnect of renewable energy certificates, that there's no net effect on total carbon emissions within the interconnect. So
No increase.
Say that one time?
No increase in total.
Correct, and no decrease and no increase, basically a wash, but it does lower costs of electricity across the interconnect overall, because you're allowing the best resources, best renewable resources that are most economical to win, and that there is still sufficient revenue collected to cover transmission requirements between the different balancing authorities.
There was more to it than that, right?
Well, yes, and so the implications are that for the same dollar, for the same impact on carbon, you can save, you know, in option number 3 here, it'd be $3 million a year. So if you're looking at on a dollars per carbon basis, that's your most efficient option, and that there is the potential, if you keep costs low, that more states and entities will adopt renewable portfolio standards, because again, you have sort of basically more market liquidity. So that could have a positive effect. And then there's anecdotal and emerging research that, that is supporting the conclusion that, you know, those models are based on dispatch models. So if I'm a wind turbine and I can ramp down a coal plant in that moment, you know, I win. But beyond that, there are investment decision models, which is how utilities really make decisions. And so if my wind turbine is backing down a coal plant an extra 20%, those investors may keep that coal plant alive for a shorter period of time. So they may decide to shut down that coal plant earlier, retire that earlier, and so that would have additional knock-on effects of getting coal off the grid earlier in coal-heavy parts of the WEC.
All right, so I'm going to try framing the question to make sure I understand it, and then we'll open up for discussion, or you'll correct me if I misunderstand it. We have a choice between buying in-state or out-of-state renewable energy resources. Out-of-state would be cheaper. The only drawback is that how it would appear on the power content label and how we would present that in the bills.
I think that's accurate.
Okay. All right, so let's leave it open for discussion, and commissioners who want to.
Just while we're on the topic of your email and the academic research, my understanding was that those models were sort of recommending as policy-wise that states like California that have a 10% limit on bucket 3 RECs, that a more appropriate number would be 25%, because that would sort of give the WEC the flexibility to sort of harvest the financial benefits without affecting carbon emissions.
Just one slight correction,
Yeah.
if I may. There's bucket 2 RECs, which are out of state and not scheduled into the ISO, and California actually allows up to 15% of the RPS to be covered by that. So between bucket 2 and bucket 3, they actually California lands right at 25% of allowable RECs can be out of state. But Palo Alto is not choosing that approach right now.
So my follow-up question is on, I think it's slide number 8, the bottom right corner, which is trading in-state renewable energy greater than the RPS requirements, it's a coincidence that we ended up with 75% in-state carbon-free resources. That number of 25% is not coming from this, from the academic research that suggests that 25% is this sort of like interesting threshold, right?
Correct. I think the 25% comes from the state limit on
It's just
out-of-state resources.
how the math shakes out given our portfolio and the state RPS requirements, et cetera. Okay, thanks.
It was actually about the 10% limit. But the accounting that you're putting forward in that pie chart is taking into account both the bucket 2 and bucket 3 recs? Is that right?
No, this assumes that we don't do any bucket 2 recs, that we kind of maximize the amount of bucket 3 recs we can do. I think we could present an option where we use bucket 2 recs as well and sell even more of our bucket 1 recs. I think under this strategy, we're assuming that we keep a little bit more of our bucket 1 recs and only use the amount of bucket 3 recs that we're entitled to use under state law.
And I'm just wondering what the rationale is behind that.
Between bucket 2 and bucket 3 recs?
Right, well, going back to that study that suggested 25% was sort of equilibrium, if you will, why not consider the other 15% option?
I think that's largely due to the discussion last month about concern, that this could be looked at as backtracking from customer perception standpoint on carbon.
I think there is actually flexibility in this option 3. We tried to simplify it as much as possible for the purpose of the discussion, but the full range of options presented last meeting are always theoretically on the table. So this is a simplified proposal.
And one more note to your point, Commissioner Forcell. Is your question, that hash green wedge looks larger than 10% of our 60%? Is it? Okay.
Thanks. So I just want to make sure that I understand this in my head as well. So option 2 is clearly preferable over the current portfolio, right? I mean, I think we all agree on that. So then the question is, do you move to option 3 or not? Staff wants to continue to pursue that, right? In looking at the two, option 3 is actually better for the environment, is what I'm hearing from you guys. Is that a fair statement? But the optics of it look worse. Is that a real simplified, but is that an appropriate thing to say, or is that not correct?
We think that would be correct if you're using the cost savings from this trading strategy to do stuff locally to decarbonize.
What happens if we just didn't? What happens if we say 50% of the cost savings went to the ratepayers, or 50% didn't? Or, I mean, just not using that money, which is superior from an environmental point of view?
I think probably a wash between option 2 and 3 here in terms of the
So
environmental.
it'd be a wash, right?
So it'd be equally green but less expensive.
Right.
Okay, so equally green but less expensive, but the optics look worse because we have that new power content label concept.
Right.
Okay, so then it's really a marketing issue, right? So that's purely the issue, right?
That's right.
I think it's also a perception.
Right, it's purely a perception
It's
issue.
going to be, from the residential standpoint, carbon neutral content label doesn't show that if we go to option number 3. And I think that's the
So
perception.
people will accuse us of not being carbon neutral, right?
It's quite possible.
So just following up on Commissioner Scharf's questions, if we go for option 2, we generate $1.2 million a year in savings. Let's assume that we put that back into the electrification infrastructure associated. At what point does the attractiveness of option 3 dissipate if we go with option 2? If the assumption is that the 3.1 million is going to go into the infrastructure and somehow that's going to annihilate the 137 pounds and the 97 pounds locally and better for the entire West, which is what I think I just heard, why wouldn't option 2 be just as good, even though we're 0 locally and we're adding to our own infrastructure improvements? If not better.
I think at that point, it comes down to how much cost-effective carbon savings do we have locally, and what is the dollars per ton that we're avoiding locally, and then we can just compare those apples to apples to what we're saving, and it's worthy of more discussion, but, so it's worthy of more discussion, but there is a smaller pool to draw from if you desired to do both rate decreases or rate stabilization and local decarbon total net decrease in emissions.
Is your question about whether there's a difference between option 2 and 3 a fundamental difference between the two?
No, I think there is a fundamental difference between 2 and 3. And the biggest one is locally, and that's the pounds per, that's here on the chart. So there is a difference. And this is talking about this public perception, right, and how we sell this to a community. Yes, it's fantastic that we can invest $3.1 million per year into the community, assuming that that's what we'll do, right? But why can't we just as well remain carbon neutral in option 2, and we're still going to invest 1.2 million per year into the community? The perception on option 2, and this is the perception is real, right? Now, if anecdotal evidence and research aside, if they are actually brought up to speed where it's no longer anecdotal, it's actual factual, in the Western Hemisphere, sorry, I shouldn't say that, Western United States is now all participating in this, and we are actually eliminating coal-fired plants, and we are eliminating, if you will, dirty power, because we're all moving to this, and in fact, everything's cheaper as a result. That's fantastic, but I guess my question is, why wouldn't option 2 also lead to that result?
I think it does lead to that result. It just, from what the academic research is saying, it's a more expensive way to get there versus option 3, if you leave aside the local investment.
So it's more expensive for the retail customer by $1.2 million per year in Palo Alto.
1.9.
$1.9 million.
And,
Sorry, am I reading the wrong number?
Yeah, no, and.
Yeah,
and,
by 1.9 million,
And
yes.
also other ISO and WEC customers overall.
Okay.
So my impression / perception at the last meeting in June was that the commissioners here were more comfortable with the middle than the right one, okay? And that's still where I'm still apprehensive about the third one. I'm not saying, I think there's a lot of complexity around this that I do not yet understand. I would like to get access to please send me the references to these academic papers. I'd like to understand it better. I just say that I'm trying to get comfortable with something that it sounds to me like a pretty intellectual argument about why this is better at the cost of essentially the public perception of Palo Alto is backing away from doing the right thing. And that's highly simplified, but I have concerns about moving in that direction. I'm not saying I can't get there. I need to do a lot more thinking about it, and I'd like to get access to those papers and try to plow through that.
Isn't that the crux of it? That we should move immediately to 2, and yet you guys should continue to explore 3. And if you can come up with if you can, I share the same concerns you have. So, I mean, if you can come up with, I don't want to use a marketing strategy, but I mean, if you can come up with it where it sounds not too complicated, and we are greener in reality, that's something worth exploring. But I mean, I do think you have to come up with something that makes sense.
I think I'm in the same position here as the last three commissioners who spoke. I think people in Palo Alto are very proud of the fact that we're carbon neutral. And I think to move away from that, we're going to have to, and whether you call it a marketing strategy or just a very simple and persuasive explanation that this is a better way. It's more environmentally friendly. I'll be very interested to hear what reaction you get from the environmental people that you're talking to, because I'm very comfortable with the middle option. I think number three, I wouldn't know how to explain it to somebody else. That, yes, we've abandoned having carbon neutral resources. We're going and buying these RECs. They're out-of-state RECs, but we're still doing better things for the planet. So great to go with option two. Great to continue to think about option three and figuring out how to explain it.
All right, I'll give them, oh, please,
Sorry,
Lauren, you go
I
ahead.
just had one final comment, and I think my level of reservation is shared. I think if I look at it from a high level, 9 miles in the air, I think I see how by buying RECs from other states, it spreads the knowledge of we are buying renewables. This is a good for our planet. So I think that's a way that we can look at this, that we can probably get our hands around it. What really is a little troublesome is the pounds CO2 per megawatt hour. That's troublesome. I recognize that we can offset that, and I recognize that Palo Alto has enough surplus that we can offset that, but it doesn't really, offsetting doesn't really represent what we're actually doing. And I guess that's the concern. It's great that we're helping our neighbors. It's great that we're communicating to the outside California or outside Palo Alto world that we're buying RECs from you. But the state of California doesn't recognize it right now. And until the state of California changes that way, it's kind of hard for us to push them unless we hold true to what are our values.
Okay, well then I'll give a different perspective. I don't see the significance of the state boundary, and that solar from San Diego or Modesto or something doesn't have greater savings for the atmosphere than wind from Wyoming. I don't think. Carbon effect's going to be the same. San Diego's not any more local to us really than Wyoming or Idaho. I think our responsibility should be to get to carbon neutral at the lowest possible cost, particularly if we want to be a model for other communities. I see 1.9 million as equivalent of 10 staff for the UAC. Dean would smile at that. I guess we all agree it's a presentational issue. It's still clean energy if we're buying it from Wyoming, whether we're buying it or Modesto. And I would have a bill insert that says every month, Palo Alto is carbon neutral. We get X amount of wind, X amount of solar, blah, blah, blah. Some of this is from out of state. And we explain that. Now there's a power content label, and we put a thing in there. This is an accounting methodology that ignores the clean energy we buy from out of state and treats it as dirty energy. We don't believe it reflects the actual situation. Anyways, I'd encourage you to go through the exercise of writing up how you would put in the bill insert and let us see it and talk about it with the environmentalists and ask them, do we gain anything by buying clean energy in Modesto instead of Wyoming? Do we gain anything by charging people more for clean energy? Do we gain anything by depriving ourselves of resources or taxing our ratepayers more. And have those discussions with environmentalists. 2 versus 1 is an easy choice. I wouldn't personally let presentational issues stop us from $2 million of savings for our ratepayers if we're equally green. And let's see if we can, come up with how we'd write that up and have those conversations with environmental groups and see if they feel differently about state boundaries.
I was going to maybe even say it a little bit more strongly, because after the last meeting, I came away probably somewhat confused and concerned, and was much more leaning, I think, to recommending 2. I spent some time talking with you and reading some of the information that you sent, and I've come around to thinking, with the caveat that I'd like to hear what the environmentalists say and whether they would be on board, because I think it would be important to have their buy-in. But absent that, it's not only do we save money, but as I understand it, we may ultimately have a bigger net effect, and whether the greenhouse gases come from Palo Alto or Wyoming or Missouri, they're all bad. And if we can cumulatively take some of those offline by retiring coal plants earlier, I think we can actually reverse the marketing and saying not only are we keeping Palo Alto clean, but we're contributing beyond our borders. And I think that's a great thing.
I think Commissioner Danaher and Commissioner Siegel very well articulated my own thoughts at this point. So I'll throw my support behind continuing to explore option number 3 as well. There's one other thing, I will add 2 thoughts. In terms of public perception, I'm actually less concerned with the Palo Alto community, that I think we can additionally sort of communicate with bill inserts and what have you. And I'm not sure how many Palo Alto residents read the power content label. But I think that it's the sort of Palo Alto as a model for other cities and other utilities where I get concerned about public perception and so I think it's not just a matter of bill inserts, but sort of, again, to Commissioner Danaher's point about sort of thinking about how we communicate. But I think it's a challenge we should be up to if it's ultimately the right thing to do. I want to just briefly go back to a conversation I had with Jonathan either last time or the time before about additionality and sort of what Palo Alto can control and it can't control, and what was, we think, the intent of City Council back when the original carbon neutral plan was adopted, around procuring actual resources, because then you sort of know that you helped bring up that wind farm or you helped bring up that solar facility that wouldn't have happened if Palo Alto wasn't there signing a contract. And just back to this table that I was asking about before, and again, trying to think of like, well, what's ultimately the right thing that the grid needs, the state needs, the Western Interconnect needs. And I just wanted to put it out there, by 2033, we're all in on solar. And I'm sad to see the wind and the landfill gas go, because I feel like in terms of sort of meeting Western United States load, we need more dispatchable resources, we need more base resources, et cetera, et cetera. So now is not the time, but I guess I would be interested in taking another look at the sort of resources we're procuring directly. And I hope it's coming up anyway, being thoughtful about the mix of the things that we're controlling more directly, and not just through sort of rec contracts or rec swapping.
Yeah, we'll certainly take that into consideration. We'll be discussing some options around new contracts for wind or other resources next year when we talk about the Western contract, whether to renew that or replace it with something else. We had some discussions around when we were doing the IRP last year, and we looked into some of the options around like wind from New Mexico, which looks like it's very low cost and would be a good complement to our hydro resources. So we'll certainly be looking into that actively.
So I'm looking at our power content label. There's one column that says power mix, and it shows us 100% hydro and renewable. And then there's a column that says California power mix, and it shows us 34% natural gas and 4% coal. So that was 2017. We already had some in that right-hand column. It makes us look dirtier than we are. To go to option 2, you don't need any action from the UAC or from the City Council, do you?
That's correct. We don't think we need to. We think we'll inform the council of any change we make in our portfolio strategies. But
darn well inform them you're saving $1.2 million a year. And credit the commission, please.
Yes, sir.
So clearly you have support to start that immediately. And clearly there's a lot of sentiment here of exploring option 3 further on that.
So when we explore option 3, I want to know whether or not when we go to our state legislators and other people, we are going to be able to, with a straight face, say we're carbon neutral. And how we're going to explain that. That's important to me. I mean, I think you're probably right, that if we get the environmental community in Palo Alto on board, that we explain it, we probably do fine like that, right? I mean, as long as they're on board. But I do think we need to be able to tell a story beyond the borders of Palo Alto. And I don't want to minimize the fact that other people do view Palo Alto as a model, and we don't want out there. Palo Alto is backing away. I think that's the wrong message. So I think we need to think that through carefully.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for, it took a while to clarify for all of us here, but thank you for being so patient and coming back to the subject. That was very, very helpful, and I think you've gotten what you need from us for now.
Okay.
Is that right?
Thank you for the discussion.
Jim and Lena, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And I'll just confirm that as far as we had talked about going back to item 4, not using banked recs, I think maybe we leave that on the table for now and think about it in the context of our exploration of this alternative.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Well, good. We're actually on schedule pretty much, despite the complicated topic. Now we have discussion of Palo Alto's water supply reliability. Carly, good evening.
Okay, our next item is a discussion of the community's perspective on water supply reliability, and it's coming to you right now because there are some opportunities over the coming year or two to look at some options for improving water supply reliability through our partner agency, BOSCA. And we'd like to get some sense of what the value of that is to our community. So we're starting with a discussion with the UAC. I have Carla Daly and Lisa Belier to present on this, and so I'll turn it right over to them.
Hi, my name is Lisa Belier, and I'm a resource planner, and I'm here to, again, ask for your feedback on this high-level question of whether Palo Alto's water supply reliability is sufficient during a drought currently. And if not, how much is Palo Alto willing to pay for greater water supply reliability during drought? We will continue to move forward with conservation and efficiency programs. That we're not questioning that here tonight. What we would like to ask you for is your input on the community's interest in supplementing the current water supply reliability during drought. So let's go over what we're going to talk about. We'll start by looking at the water supply overview, the experience during the recent drought, the current level of service goal for water supply reliability, how water is allocated during droughts currently, and then risks going forward. And then we'll go through some discussion questions. I'm only going to briefly talk about potential projects. We want to try to get your feedback on this really high-level question. So just as an overview, Palo Alto receives 100% of its potable water supplies from the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. And Palo Alto uses some recycled water at city facilities that it makes up about 7% of the total water supply for the city. There are 8 emergency water wells and 7 storage reservoirs. So during the last drought, Palo Alto's water customers conserved a great deal of water. The state mandatory cutback level was 24%, and Palo Alto water customers saved 31.4% during that required cutback period. Palo Alto took several actions that are listed on the slide, including stepping up outreach and education, an app for citizen reporting, fines, additional conservation and efficiency, and then various temporary measures that some of them became permanent. And you can see a listing of those measures, both that were in place before the drought, additional measures that were put in place during the drought, and those that became permanent after the drought, including things like no automatic irrigation between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., no potable water in fountains, no potable water for street sweepers, recirculating water in commercial car washes, just to give you a sense of the types of impacts. Since the last drought, water consumption has not come back up to pre-drought levels. For Bosca customers as a whole, so far in 2019, consumption is about 8% lower than in 2013 prior to the recent drought.
Is that because we've had higher rainfall, people are watering less?
I think there's a part of it that's because of measures that were taken during the drought becoming permanent. But I don't know for certain, but on the whole, for all the Bosca customers and for Palo Alto, there seems to be some permanent sticking conservation as a result of those measures. So you can see for Palo Alto as well that in the first 6 months of fiscal year 2019, usage was almost 11% lower than in 2013. And later there's a little chart of the usage. Again, although there's not a drought surcharge currently in place, there are fixed costs that have to be recovered when usage drops. And so there was a drought surcharge in place during the drought. Currently, the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission has several level of service goals. The one that's most relevant here is to not have more than a 20% cutback during a drought, and that's 20% across the retail customers that they serve in San Francisco and the wholesale customers that they serve in other parts of the Bay Area. San Francisco does this by planning for an 8.5-year dry period, which is based on actual conditions from two historical droughts put together, the 1987 to 1992 drought and the 1976 to 77 drought. This is just a picture showing how the water is allocated when there is a drought. It's allocated first through the Tier 1 plan to retail customers and wholesale customers, and you can see that in the pie chart at the top, that approximately 1/3 goes to the retail customers in San Francisco and 2/3 to the wholesale customers. And then that water that's available to the wholesale customers is divvied up among those customers through an agreement that the customers have with each other, and that's called the Tier 2 plan. And you can see that in the pie chart that's at the bottom. And that formula, that Tier 2 formula, considers outdoor usage. So the customers that have more outdoor usage are asked to cut back more. So this is just to show you how it all nets out for Palo Alto in a drought when there's a 20% system-wide shortage. And I should say this is when the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission declares a 20% shortage. That did not happen in the most recent drought because of the state mandated reductions that took place. But theoretically going forward, when SFPUC declares the drought, these are the impacts for Palo Alto.
Could you just explain that, because that doesn't make sense to me, how the state mandated stopped us from having the 23%?
Just in an unprecedented move, the state set reductions for each urban retail water supplier in the state, and Palo Alto received the reduction of 24%. It turns out that Palo Alto's cutback is very similar under the Tier 1 and Tier 2 formula, but that's just a coincidence. We don't know what the state would do going forward, but we do not have any reason to believe that they would do that mandated reduction again.
Why do we not think they would do it again? I mean, they did it before. Why wouldn't they do it again?
Yeah.
I mean, they've kind of said they don't want to do it again. It was not a comfortable position for the state to be in, and so they've moved toward a Making Conservation in California way of life regulatory framework, where the objective is to get long-term permanent conservation largely out of reducing irrigation load. But it was kind of a big deal for the governor to declare an emergency and for the state to come in and tell each agency what to cut back. They would prefer not to be in that position and to have more of a long-term view of water conservation.
So this is a view of the Palo Alto annual water purchases for the last 30 years or so, and then a forecast going forward. From the version that I think you received, I went ahead and updated to include the 2019 usage levels, which went down a little bit, but it doesn't change the overall picture. And what I wanted to point out is that a 23% cutback from the recent levels of 2019 or 2018 would be harder to achieve, maybe harder to achieve going forward, because it would require that cutback to a lower level than has ever been done before based on the hardened demand. I just have a quote here on water management is risk management, and our risks are changing. And this is from Wade Crowfoot, Secretary for Natural Resources. But even if you don't take climate change into account, if you just look at a longer historical record than what we have in the recorded hydrologic record of the last 100 years, we know that there have been more serious droughts in the past that have gone on for 10 years or more. But then, if you do think about climate change, future shortages may be more frequent and more severe. The impact that we're really thinking about here is the frequency of the drought. So what I'm going to do is just go through these discussion questions, and then you can be thinking about them for just a quick moment while I talk briefly about some of the project ideas from BOSCA.
Just to clarify.
Yes.
When you talk about a 23% reduction, you're talking from 2018 levels, not from 2013 levels?
It would be from the most recent year.
Okay.
And so
So in
the
other
most
words,
recent non-drought year, excuse me.
that already assumes a lot of water savings messages, water savings.
At the moment, it does. I mean,
Yeah.
water usage could go back up, but assuming that it's at the more recent levels and it levels out, and after the drought rebound, then it could be more difficult to reach that same 23% number.
Okay. I just want to know what the reference point was. Thank you.
Yes.
So what we're really saying is that every time we tell people to save water, we set a new bar that's lower, so that if we have a drought, we are less resilient. There's less fat in the system to cut, right? So the more people cut back, the more difficult it becomes in a drought to deal with it, right?
I would say in one sense that's true, but in another sense, I mean, during a drought, there's a certain bucket of water that's available and everybody has to share it. And so to the extent that everyone has lessened their demand, that bucket of water is going to go further for
But
everyone.
that assumes we wouldn't have a 23% cutback then, because it assumes that everyone else has cut back too, so it wouldn't be that high. Because
That's
otherwise,
possible.
you're getting the 23 or 24% cutback, and the less your base is, the worse off you are, right?
True.
I mean, I'm not suggesting we should tell people to spend more water. I just think as a base, we need to understand that, at least I'm looking at this saying to myself, if we as a community continue to tell people to cut back water, that number may continue to go down. And I don't know if you could bring that up. If we look at where we were 5 years ago, if we're actually 5 years further down on that and that's the new normal is even lower than that, that would argue for coming up with some other more water resilient way.
Right.
Because it could be worse than this. That's really what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah.
We are.
That was my point.
We are going to be subject to the state regulations around making conservation a California way of life, and so we are going to have to meet some conservation targets. So it's not going to be a choice that Palo Alto is going to make of whether to inspire conservation or not. We're going to have to do it.
But we're already doing it, aren't we? I mean, what more is the state going to ask of us that we're not doing? That's always an interesting question.
We don't know our targets yet, but there will be new targets that we'll have to meet over a long time horizon. So we will have to continue. I mean, we've been aggressive with conservation already, but we're not probably going to have the option to back off on any of that.
But I think to your point earlier, if Palo Alto's cutting back and so are all the other communities, then the likelihood that a cutback is triggered in the first place goes way down because we're less likely to need to trigger it if we're all using 20 or 30% less water in the first place.
Right.
Although the headwinds, I mean, the other factors that are in play are things like climate change and regulatory changes to try and help with fisheries that, regardless of decreased consumption, could result in or could offset the impacts of decreased consumption, leading to similar levels of potential frequency and severity of drought cutbacks that we see now, or perhaps even worse.
So the point is that 23% cutback is harder now than it was in 2013.
Right.
And we just have to recognize that as we talk about other resources.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Oops. So, these are exactly the kinds of things that we want to talk about. Is 23% water use reduction during a drought enough supply reliability for Palo Alto going forward? Can the community sustain a 23% reduction? What if the droughts get longer or more frequent? And if Palo Alto could participate in a project that would mitigate the impact of drought on people and businesses, whereby water use reductions would be kept to less than 20% in most drought conditions, is that something the community would be interested in? And how much would the community be willing to pay for that? We don't know the costs, but we've thrown out some numbers here to think about, 1%, 2% rate increases. let me just mention really briefly that BOSCA has looked at the water supply situation and determined that there are dry year additional water needs, and a couple of strategies that they've identified that can help to achieve those dry water year needs are water transfers and water storage. And then again, in Palo Alto, we're continuing conservation and efficiency programs. We're looking into water reuse and as part of the Northwest County Recycle Water Strategic Plan. And just as part of that, and we've looked into the possibility of using groundwater. Preliminary estimates are that Palo Alto could pump about 20% of the potable water supply from the groundwater. However, groundwater may be restricted also during multi-year droughts. So those are just some things to think about, as we would love to hear any input that you have or other questions you have on the discussion questions.
We start at this end. Any questions or comments?
Just one comment as I look at this slide. I think it's absolutely a worthwhile discussion, but if I'm going to focus on statistics, the 23% to 20%, is that measurable? I mean, is that a significant cut? Is 23 to 20? If I'm being asked to 23 and the give is 20, is that much of a win, right? In other words, if you're asking me to pay more just to get to 20% or survive at 23%, I might actually just agree to survive at 23%. If we're taking it from 23% down to 15% and I'm going to pay 5 cents, that's maybe measurable. That's my own comment.
The delta that we've been talking about at BOSCA is about a 5% delta. So it would go from 23% down to 18% for Palo Alto is a good way to think about it. And that is a good question. We have a water shortage contingency plan where at different levels we put into place different measures. I think, one measure to maybe make it feel a little more concrete is the number of days a week that folks were allowed to irrigate last drought. Mm-hmm. And we did 2 days a week. How much is it worth to be able to do 3 days a week? Is that significant? Is it not significant? I mean, I think those are kind of the measures that might move a little bit if it were a 23% reduction need versus an 18%.
Thank you.
So we pay this additional amount, $225,000 to $900,000 a year. Where does the additional water come from? What are we getting for our money?
You go ahead.
So, I mean, we are trying not to focus on specific projects for this discussion and get sort of that higher level feedback from you on just the value of reliability. But like Lisa said, a couple of the projects that are in the works are storage or water transfers during drought.
So we would be paying into a storage project?
Correct.
And we'd have certain rights to, I mean, I understand that's not the only thing, but I'm trying to get my head around.
Correct. That's one way to do it. And we as BOSCA have been focusing on dry year type projects versus a desal plant. That you wouldn't build a desal plant to just address a drought year problem. It's way too expensive. That's a base resource type of project. So that would be something that you'd look at if you had a average year need. Things like storage come in handy in droughts, and so those are the types of projects that BOSCA's been looking at.
Start at this end?
Sure.
Yeah.
So a couple things. I think divorced from a project, it's actually harder to make the decision. We do have the water purification project we've talked about, right, in our own, at our own water treatment plant. I think that's something that's interesting, and that's long-term for Palo Alto, and I think, haven't we been talking about doing that with some of our regional partners as well, and basically dealing with the water? So that interests me. I think it's really impossible to answer this question. So I think on the high level, I think the answer is, I think it would be worth paying more money to have more water security. But to Lauren's question, for 3%, it may not be worth it. For 5%, what does 5% mean to the average person? You'd have to tell me. I mean, does it mean that I can water my plants on more days? And, you know, how does that play into being able to use our groundwater? Because you said it may be restricted, but is it not restricted the first 3 years or 4 years? But it's restricted if we had a 10-year drought, the last 4. What are the odds on a 10-year drought? When was the last time we had one? You know, at least in my experience, it's always protecting against, you know, years 8 to 10 that are the most expensive. I mean, that the further it out, the protection, the more expensive, and the marginal return on that often starts to deteriorate. So I think without really understanding this more, it's really hard for me to say where I would go. Other than that, I think staff should be looking at it. I think individual projects are interesting. Should Palo, I mean, $900,000 a year is a lot of money. I mean, what if Palo Alto did a 2% rate increase and built their own storage facility without Bosca?
It's half of what we could save from bucket 3.
No, I mean, yeah, so, I mean, there's some truth to that, right? I mean, let's say we saved the $2 million and we, you know, figured out how to, you know, maybe we could store electricity by having that water storage high and then having our own little turbine. So therefore, it's to the benefit of the ratepayers in electricity. I'm just saying that I do think it's worthwhile. I would like to know, I mean, $900,000, if you bond $900,000, that's still a lot of money. I mean, how much could we have our own storage, you know?
Lauren?
I guess I have pretty much the same sentiment. So one question I had, though, is in terms of water usage, how it breaks down between commercial, residential, and irrigation versus in buildings. And if there's conservation, does the individual ratepayer have any control over how those conservation efforts are, you know, taken by that individual ratepayer versus a mandatory irrigation limitation or something like that?
So your question is getting at the control that an individual has to control their costs?
Well, first, I'd just like to know how the usage shakes out. Yeah.
It's about 50% single-family residential. And do you know irrigation? I think it's about less than 20% irrigation.
That's irrigation only, but you're asking overall water usage in Palo Alto, how much is being used indoors versus outdoors? Is that what you're asking?
Right, indoor, outdoor, and then commercial versus residential. Indoor, outdoor.
The number that I have in my head that is a few years old that I need to check is about 72% indoor.
Sorry, I guess I have one question as well. Sorry, am I interrupting? So we're talking about, it's almost like we're trying to make a community resilient against something that might happen. We can talk about resiliency a lot of different ways, but we're trying to make our community resilient. But part of making a community resilient is making the people who live here also resilient, right? So how do they deal with things? And one of the ways that we do it, we plant cactus, right? Water tolerant plants are independent of water. We look at gray water. And I guess that would be my question for this particular line of question is how much are we encouraging, for example, the use of gray water? Or is it even encouraged? Or quite frankly, based upon 5,000 square foot lots on average in Palo Alto, can we actually do gray water? Or are there circumstances such that we can't actually use gray water for irrigation? We just put everything back.
We do encourage gray water, and we have a program to help customers put in gray water systems. So
Okay.
We do encourage that. And we also have a lawn replacement program as well.
Okay. And so if I, just continuing my thinking, if we are creating this resilient, drought-tolerant society, if you will, where there is no water for an extended period of time, 8 years, it sounds like, should we be encouraging programs that look at that? Or should we be looking at programs that simply store water? It's almost a behavioral question, if you will. And that's similar to this pay rate, right? You're giving someone an option to say, you're paying more for security versus changing in behavior.
So I'm going to see if I answer your question. If I don't, certainly tell me. But we will be pursuing conservation programs. We will not be backing off on those no matter what we do around this other question. We will be encouraging conservation and looking at programs, participating in programs that help customers reduce their water usage. That's the highest priority. We do that no matter what. We will also have targets around that imposed on us by the state that we're waiting to hear, and those will be indoor per capita residential usage targets and outdoor irrigation targets. The state's developing those right now. We don't know what those are, but my intuition is that Palo Alto is probably above in outdoor usage what the state is going to tell us we need to be. And so Palo Alto has some of the highest per capita water usage of all the Bosque agencies. So we've got some room to improve.
We have
on
our
that.
canopy to protect.
We have a beautiful canopy, and we want to protect our canopy, but we have some room to conserve some more. But this question is around, is San Francisco's level of service goal fine for us, or do we want something in addition? Do we want to be able to cut back a little less when there's a water supply shortage?
And just adding to that, Lisa and Carla, please correct me if I say anything wrong here, but I think sort of underlying your question is, can we use conservation as a way of helping ourselves during a drought? Is that right? And I think what's a little bit perverse is that we will absolutely pursue conservation. We do want to get our usage down, but those 23% cutbacks are relative to whatever your usage level is. So if you have a very highly water efficient community, you still have to do a 23% cutback with most traditional efficiency. Now, if you look at things like recycled water, alternative water sources, you're reducing the amount of water that you're importing, and so that may help you because you only have to make that 23% cut in the amount of water that you import. But just making your use more efficient doesn't end up helping you in the drought. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does, and thank you. But I think it also just reinforces exactly the point that Greg was making earlier, that if we set our target here and we're operating here, the new low is here and you have to be here. So we're cutting our feet, then we're cutting our ankles, then we're cutting our knees. Do you see? So I think there is some consideration there. Big fan of conservation, big fan of gray water, big fan of, I think we're saying the same thing for this resiliency, right? Creating an alternative source or looking somewhere outside of San Francisco for a source of water, be it our own storage or some other thing. And I think that absolutely makes sense and would encourage that look. And if there is an alternative source to San Francisco, that would mean we either store it or we buy it from someplace else, then we should probably investigate that. It's not scary, but it's certainly, we should be mindful and wary of what the state will mandate, because I do see that downward push would be good from a city perspective to have a way of pushing back up. if you
So
will.
I'm going to, in the interest of time, and move this along. Lisa, did you have any comments to add to this subject?
I just have one question. Do I understand correctly that it's sort of like, it's a step function? We either have no mandatory cutbacks or we jump to 23%? Or is it a gradual reduction depending on the severity of the drought conditions?
The Tier 1 and Tier 2 plan are for droughts that are up to 20% that are declared by the SFPUC. So there's really a plan in place for that level of drought, and SFPUC's level of service goal is to not have cutbacks that are greater than that level. But cutbacks could be 5% or 10%, and we just didn't show you all those numbers here. Does that answer your question?
I think so. And so it can also go greater than 20%. Like SFPUC declares it's 5%, it's 10%, it's 35%, and then the formula spits out how much Palo Alto's cutback is. No, that's not it.
Those formulas don't apply above a 20% system-wide shortage.
What formulas apply above a 20%?
No formula. It's, let's all sit down
the
and
Wild
figure out
West.
how to
Okay.
meet public health and safety needs.
Okay.
That's the world you're in above 20% system-wide.
Gotcha, but it is a sliding scale up to 20%. Yeah, I mean, I think my only feedback is similar to Commissioner Scharf's, that I think I need more time to think about it, as well as to not just give you feedback based on my own personal, gut, but to try to talk to my neighbors and other people and sort of get a sense of the larger community, what the appetite is for this trade-off.
That would be helpful.
Just briefly, I just have one
please.
comment. So I think we need to protect our landscaping infrastructure in Palo Alto. And I think, our canopy is probably the number one thing we think about. But also in our residential neighborhoods, people spend a lot of money on their landscaping, and I think that's a worthwhile thing to protect. And I think we need to think about it as infrastructure that you want to protect, and that I get a little concerned when we say things like, Palo Alto has a lot of room to cut back. I don't know if that's true or not, but when you look at how much water is used, it's directly correlated to the size of people's lots. So if you have a very dense community like San Francisco, where you don't have a lot of landscaping, you are going to use less water. And I'm sure in the outer Richmond, they use more water than they do in other parts of the city. And so I think we need to value our single-family neighborhoods, frankly, and the infrastructure that they have, and not necessarily think that we should allow that infrastructure to be destroyed. And I mean, especially our canopy. I mean, I think all of Palo Alto loves that. And in the last drought, there was a lot of damage to our trees. And I actually think that we should come up with a plan so that doesn't happen. And I think that should be part of our thinking on this.
Can I just add, I think that's a really interesting way to think about it too. And the way the Tier 1 and Tier 2 plans work is communities with more outdoor irrigation cut back more than communities like San Francisco, where everybody's living in an apartment and nobody has a beautiful tree outside their house. And so one way to think about this extra 5% is, I think it's relatively true to say that's a 5% that we could use outdoors. And is that valuable? I think you hit on something really significant, the tree canopy. It's come up a few times, and something that Palo Alto really, really, really values. And so is it worth that extra 5% to be able to water another day a week, to be able to, whatever it is, to keep that landscaping healthy? And
So I would just say that I think most people would be willing to have a 2% rate increase, or possibly more, if they knew that would protect their canopy over it. I mean, I think that would be an easy translation for people. It says, yes, we're going to be able to water our trees. We're not going to have that issue. But I mean, that's why I think we need to think about it like that.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I mentioned canopy earlier because the trees in front of my house have not recovered from the drought. We took too much water-saving initiatives. I want to thank staff for bringing this up. In the last couple of years, we've asked several times about exactly this. Droughts could get worse with climate change and the like, and what are our long-term preparations? what do we do with building codes, gray water? I'm glad the city has a program. I wasn't aware of that. I think it'd be great to rank order from cost effectiveness the type of projects that could be done, which include, the water purification, but storage and other things, and have more discussion about this. I do think another 23% cut from where we are. I mean, we've put in water-saving appliances, water-saving gardens since the drought at our house. Another big cut is you've already taken a lot of the fat off there. So I think it's important. Really, thank you for bringing this up, and we should return to the subject. One last comment when we talk about legislative positions and policies. We should be encouraging the state, when they think about cutbacks, to use a baseline like 2013 so that communities aren't being punished in 2020 or things for being good citizens along the way, and for measures they've already taken. That gets back to the first point that Greg mentioned in our discussion. But really, thank you again, and we'll move on to the next topic. All right. Our next topic won't take too long because PG&E has told us nothing. We talked with Dean about this on Monday, so we may actually finish on schedule. But Catherine, please. So
Chair Danaher and I talked a little bit about this, bringing it to the commission a little ahead of time about the wildfire safety from PG&E. Now, Catherine and I have gone to symposiums as well as some websites or webinars, and we've talked to PG&E directly through our NCPA, through our ISO, and I know this probably isn't exactly what you wanted to hear in this report portion of it. You probably wanted a little bit more details, but this is pretty much about what we know as of today. So I'm going to let Catherine Everett, our communications manager, go over this report. Catherine?
Thank you, Dean. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Catherine Elvert. I'm the Utilities Communications Manager. First of all, to the carbon accounting discussion, I will be your person coordinating the messaging, so thank you very much for the input on how we can structure that. So Chair Danaher did request that we bring this item for discussion before you tonight, and that is likely because you've probably heard in the news about PG&E's Public Safety Power Shutoff Program. It's been quite an important topic, and so a lot of eyes are on this. And so the question is, how does this potentially affect Palo Alto, and how will we respond? How are we reaching out to the community to tell them what impacts we may see, and what actions are we going to take locally, either in response to PG&E shutting off a major transmission line, and or what are we going to do with our local electric distribution system. So I can go ahead and give you just a real high-level executive summary of what you have in the report before you, and then we can open it up for discussion. And feel free to interject with any questions at any time. So as Dean mentioned, we have been communicating with PG&E and other stakeholders, both internal and external, to understand the potential impacts to Palo Alto based on PG&E's Public Safety Power Shutoff Program. The company has been communicating its plans to de-energize power lines when conditions pose a high risk for wildfire related to utility infrastructure. So while PG&E does not directly serve electricity to Palo Alto customers, the city intakes electricity from PG&E's major transmission lines. If PG&E shuts down a major transmission line that serves Palo Alto, there is the potential that there could be impacts to our power supplies. And if there is a statewide incident that's even broader than the region, there's a possibility that we could see rolling blackouts. So we're working with partners such as the Northern California Power Agency, NCPA, and other utilities that are transmission dependent on PG&E's system to understand how this will affect us. We are trying to establish clear communication with PG&E and protocols for how they will notify us if they anticipate any impacts
2 transmission serving us. And we are developing local communication plans so that we can inform our customers what to expect, how we will notify them, how to prepare for an unexpected power outage should there be larger outages throughout the city. So we've developed a number of communication strategies, web content, we are attending emergency preparedness and safety fairs to let people know what they can do to prepare themselves, because while PG&E tells us that they hope to provide us with at least a 48 or 24-hour notice in advance of a public safety power shutoff, there is no guarantee that they will be able to do that, nor will we be able to provide ample notice to our customers in advance if we anticipate either rolling blackouts or a load curtailment requirement, or maybe even a local outage along our electric distribution system. So in Palo Alto, the foothills area, as you are probably aware, is probably at the most elevated risk of wildfire conditions. We monitor the area very closely. We collaborate with other public safety departments such as fire and police and emergency services. We'll make sure that we make decisions locally on operation of the electric distribution system up there in the foothills based on the best interest and safety for our customers, and also regarding our knowledge of the infrastructure up there. Additionally, we are taking measures to mitigate the potential for wildfire, such as ensuring that we're clearing vegetation appropriately, we're taking a look at our electric lines, we're evaluating areas in which we may need to make any repairs or upgrades on our own infrastructure, and we're coordinating with the Urban Forestry Department on that as well. So we are also developing a wildfire mitigation plan, which staff expect to have complete before the end of 2019, and that will go to the City Council. So that is the gist of where we are at right now. I would like to go ahead and welcome any questions and discussion.
I brought this up because I wanted us, as commissioners, we might be asked, I didn't want to sound ignorant. We did talk in our conversation Monday about backup for hospitals, public safety and the like, and that's largely in place. That PG&E might give us notice, might not. I think it'd be interesting if we could at some point, if they'd provide a map that showed if there's this transmission line is closed, you'd be affected, this one you'd not be, so that we can monitor weather and fire conditions and make some estimates of our own if we're likely to have problems. And we talked about if we did have 2 days notice that there may be curtailment, we can advise our citizens through the phone system. We have the robocalls and the like, that if everybody cuts back 30% or something, then maybe we don't have a blackout in Palo Alto. So there's some actions we can take, but by and large, PG&E hasn't said very much about specifics, what action here would affect us there and how much. And it'd be nice if they developed that.
I guess there's one thing maybe I'm not understanding with the transmission lines, where I thought it was sort of the west in the hills part of Palo Alto that's most vulnerable. So
I think we're mixing two different
Okay.
things. So what Palo Alto does in its territory, Catherine got to that, and that's very important. What PG&E does maybe 100 miles away or something, shutting down some transmission line, may end up impacting how much power gets fed to our grid in Palo Alto. And that was the primary point of this presentation.
So that's a good question. Is it all or nothing? I thought it was all or nothing. I didn't think they would actually, because we have one line that comes in, I thought it was, that line's either energized or it's not. If it's energized, we get all the power we normally get, right? It's not like they cut the power half. You don't get like a third of the power, right? It's all power or no power. Or is that wrong? I mean, I'm confused.
If I may defer to Dean on this?
So I think the thing is that we may get a portion, and the way they do that is they would transfer that transmission power. So right now, maybe what they have is maybe they have 4 lines coming out, 2 of them are affected. They are able to still move some of that capacity over to those other 2 lines that can then go down and feed. However, it won't be at the full potentials of adding those 4, whatever that is. If it's 500 kV, then maybe we don't think they can only switch 125 of that. So they would then take that and continue rolling it down, but it won't have the same impact as if it was one up 100%. So they could ask us to cut back 25% of our loads, or, every city coming down the peninsula portion of it. So that's why we might have some rolling blackout portions. And that would be the thing. Now, if it's more localized, I would guarantee that we're going to be down 100% then at that period of time.
Not having battery energy crisis, the rolling blackouts.
Right.
So I had a question just about, we say we have some of our own electric generation. How much do we have, and is it dedicated for certain uses?
So that's an interesting question. So we do have dedicated 4 units that has 5 megs worth of service on it. And on any typical day, we usually run about 180 megawatts that we have to actually do. So it's even less than, what's that, 5%, 4% of our power. The interesting thing was that we found out when we had the airplane incident back in 10, when we went 100% totally dark, we could not start those generators. Those generators are not black. They don't start from scratch because they actually have to have some power going to them because of the way that they were hooked into the system, that it was just used during the power energy crisis, that they were going to be used for some of the rolling blackouts to subsidize some of the losses that we would have in those areas, and we would roll those through the neighborhoods. So I would say at this period of time, that's really not a really good option. So one of the things that I've asked engineering is to take a look at is to take a look at what would it bring if, and what's the cost look like if we brought 50, 60 megs of power into the city somewhere. So maybe we take out those 4 units, and what's that cost going to really look like? Or, maybe we can find something that would get up to 100. So I've asked them to scale this to see what kind of generators. So they're going to be turbine generators that we would be looking at that period of time. And, again, they're just going to be sitting there just like these are, but it would give us some sense of, because as we all know, this isn't going to go away. This is going to get worse and worse for us. So the thing is that to look at that. Now, Lauren, the question a little bit about just going up the foothill real quick is that is not a transmission line that's going up there. It's just a 12,000 kV line that you would see in your normal residence. And so it serves about the 70 customers that we actually have up in the hills. So one of the things that we're doing is we're putting a switch in down at the base of 280, just where the line starts to go up into the hills. And we're going to put SCADA on that so that in case if there was a situation where the wind started coming up or that we found that thing would go down, it would actually automatically shut off at that period of time. We're also going to look at maybe relocating that line. That line goes right through the middle of the foothills going up there. We're thinking about maybe rebuilding that line and actually putting it closer to the street side, because right now we really can't really get to it. Everything has to be, we can't really drive our vehicles up in there to, if a pole snapped or something like that, it would all have to be walked in and everything else. So we're looking at that as well. But for right now, the quick fix is to put this switch in. This switch, which we're in the process right now. And then we'll be able to control that from our system operators that would be able to have control of that switch at any given time.
Well, I hope it doesn't happen, but it's conceivable there could be wildfires and shutdown before this commission meets again next. And Dean, I'm glad you folks are thinking about it. Lisa, you had a question, sir?
I just had a quick question inspired by the thought of curtailment. Can you remind us what percentage of our load at any given time is commercial versus residential?
Go ahead. It's roughly 85% commercial, correct, and about 15% residential? Did I get that right?
So the real win in curtailment is turning to the commercial customers to get that 25 or 30% that we imagine might come down.
That is correct. And we do have a number of large business customers whom we call key accounts. We have dedicated key account representatives who communicate directly with those folks. For example, the facility managers at the larger businesses up at the Stanford Research Park. So theoretically, we could be able to communicate pretty quickly with those customers and effectively shed load.
So thank you for the information. Any other questions or comments on this topic? All right. Catherine, thanks. Last item is selection of potential topics for future meetings. We have the rolling calendar in here somewhere. Both, as we look at this, both topics you might want to see added to future sessions, or as you look at the September topics, you see things like such as EV charging, anything that you'd like that presentation to address as part of that.
Well, I hope that when we talk about recycled water, the discussion will kind of feed into what we were talking tonight about how we could use recycled water to increase our water supplies during a drought.
Yep.
It would also be interesting to me to maybe get a little bit of insight in the water quality report and how recycled water might change the quality.
Okay, good. Lisa, you've done a lot of studies on the EVs and the grid. Do you have anything particular you want that presentation to cover?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. I would like to, I've talked before about future proofing and how I think EV charging needs to be networked eventually, if there's been any, thinking about that or understanding of that. Commissioners, we've talked earlier, but we also have the opportunity to ask for, we don't want to create a lot of work for the staff, they're heavily worked, but we can ask for informational presentations that perhaps don't take much time to put together, but that add to our knowledge base as we go along. And so, maybe not tonight or other times, but if there are topics of that occur to you, I'd like 10 minutes on how we deal with customer complaints or whatever it is. Dean and team are happy to accommodate that.
Can I ask about, I'm just looking ahead to October, and I see a resiliency workshop. Can you tell us some more about what's planned there?
That, I guess the thing is, that's still really tentative right at the moment. Debbie Lloyd is out on some health right now, so I haven't really had an opportunity to follow up with her to find out, so I'm not really sure if we're going to be able, we may push that out to actually November. We'll get something together before the end of the year, and then we should probably have a conversation amongst the commissioners to talk a little bit about what we want to see in that workshop.
Okay.
But it's tentative right now, I'd have to say.
Dean and Jonathan, when we talked about the strategic plan, I think it was last year, in spring or whatever, one of the key topics was sustaining the workforce. And is it worth having a report on that at hiring, staffing, and how that's coming? Maybe not, but at some point this fall?
Yes. We could do, if you'd like, we could do a quarterly report.
Sure.
Just kind of throw it in there as informational for you all. It'll give you a little bit about where our openings are, what openings have been filled. I can tell you now that we're down to maybe about 30, I'd have to ask Dave for sure, but I think it's right around 32 openings right now. We're down from about 44, 45 was the high portion of it. We're still looking for linemen. We're still looking for some system operators. Our key critical positions, we haven't been able to pull anybody in at this period of time. There's some interviews that are going to be happening for some of the line work. We just did one. We didn't find anybody in it. We did interviews, so there's going to be another one next month that we're going to do. Hopefully, we'll see if somebody else will come then at that period of time. But we're not seeing any increases in that area right now. And then the majority of the openings are in the electric side, on the operational side. That's where the majority of the openings are right now.
This group has no control over salaries and the like, but we can at least highlight issues for the city council.
Yeah, the thing is that we were fortunate through all of your work, as well as the council was generous through the last SEIU contract, that those critical positions that we deemed critical, which was the system operators positions, our compliance techs, and then also our line folks, there was a 20% increase given to those. There's another 3% that will be given out to those groups here in December. And then there'll be another 3%, as well as the rest of the SEIU will get next year as well. So there was given a 26% increase over the next 2 years, basically. So
maybe a periodic report would be useful.
Okay.
Lauren, anything else?
Yeah, just on the tutorial side, I would like to better understand utility poles and what rights we have, what rights other, I know I'm walking into.
No, that's very basic, and it's a wonderful question, because I don't know the rules either, yeah.
Right, and then maybe how some of the concerns about cell towers plays into that.
Okay, we can do that.
Great. So, is there a motion to adjourn?
I move we adjourn.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John and Dean.